Greetings. My name is Reem Zoun. I'm the Director of Flood Planning with the Texas Water Development Board. The topic of my presentation today is statewide flood plan mapping and planning efforts, an update from TWDB. Mine is the second of a series of presentations from TWDB. My colleague Saul focused on flood mapping earlier today. My presentation is going to focus on the flood planning effort and a little bit on the mitigation effort as well. Hurricane Harvey dropped 34 trillion gallons of rain over Texas. It impacted 30% of Texas population. The total damage from Hurricane Harvey amounted to about 125 billion. So when we talk about flood planning, I always want to touch on why. Why are we doing this? Research shows that flood preparation and protection dollars goes much farther than recovery effort, or dollar spent on recovery effort. Dollar to dollar value on dollar spent on preparation and protection is much higher than dollar spent on recovery efforts. It says, we are all aware Hurricane Harvey made national and state headlines after it. In the wake of historic flooding in Texas, the 2019 Texas Legislature passed a sweeping set of laws to create Texas's first ever regional and state flood planning process. Requiring regional and interregional cooperation, the legislature charged the Texas Water Development Board with creating flood planning regions based on river basins and administering the ongoing work of flood planning. The ultimate goals of this planning effort are regional flood plans, which are due in September of 2023, and a state flood plan, which will be due in January of 2024. That will identify flood risks and strategies and projects to reduce the risk and impact of flooding in the coming years. This slide shows the combined fatality between 2010 and 2018 in the different US states. One number seems to stand out. I know we like everything bigger and better in Texas, but this is a number we don't want to be bigger than the other state. We can do much better than 212 fatalities due to flooding. Along with the regional flood planning process, the legislature also created a new flood assistance fund, the Flood Infrastructure Fund, or FIF, to finance flood-related projects. The TWDB was also charged with administering that fund. These are the three pillars of TWDB flood risk reduction effort that's currently ongoing parallelly. They're the mapping, planning, and the mitigation effort. In an ideal world, mapping would have happened first, planning would have happened second based on that mapping, and then the mitigation financing would happen based on the planning. Since we are doing all three parallelly right now, they're happening independently. However, the mapping, to the extent possible completed, will be incorporated to the planning process. The mitigation financing, or the FIF fund, is currently being administered. Once the planning process is done, the project identified through the planning process will inform the mitigation financing process. Like I mentioned earlier, my presentation today will focus on regional and state flood planning process. The SBA directs TWDB to develop a state flood plan which must provide for orderly preparation for the response to flood conditions to protect against the loss of life and property, be a guide to state and local flood control policy, and contribute to water development where possible. Here is an outline of my presentation today. So I'm going to talk about the why, where, how, and when of flood planning. The purpose of the flood planning process, the key purpose, is to protect against loss of life and property. The old adage of prevention is better than cure applies to flood risk as well. The flood planning is going to focus on preventing creation of new risk. Water needs space to flow. Staying out of that space of water flow or flood flow helps us, keeping us away from harm's way, or helps prevent us from putting in harm's way. So flood planning process will identify those areas and will help prevent creation of new risk. Flood planning will also focus on reducing the risk for those who are already in harm's way. As we all know that the storm we have been experiencing in recent past has been larger, sometimes even more frequent. Atlas 14 is indicative of that. Atlas 14 was based on rainfall that has already happened or happened in the past. The other piece is there are a lot of developments that were done prior to regulation. Neighborhoods that were built in the 1900s, 1950s, some of them did not have the benefit of the knowledge and regulation that we have today due to advancement in technology that happens every day. Two examples come to mind. The city of Austin, the developments that happened prior to 1977 versus after 1977, there is a disparity based on when the drainage criteria manual was adopted and that requirement was in place to prevent development and having them put in harm's way. Harris County Flood Control District is another example. Before 1990s, some of the regions in Harris County Flood Control District has infrastructures with level of service at 5-year capacity. The other point I wanted to make is that we never really fully mitigate flood risk. What we do is prepare and develop and do projects in a way where we reduce the risk and we prepare for it appropriately. There will always be residual risk, and understanding this piece is important. Next, I'm going to talk about where this flood planning is going to happen. On April 9 of 2020, the TWDB designated 15 flood planning regions. The Senate Bill 8 specifies that planning should be done by river basins. This flood planning region boundary map is indicative of that flood planning process along those river basins. Some of the larger river basins were split into two, which you can see in the flood planning region boundaries. And that was due to the feedback we received, and also, as we all know, the rainfall pattern and geographical coverage in east of Texas and west Texas is pretty different. Next, I'm going to touch on the flood planning process. Here is the overview of the flood planning process by the numbers. There are 15 flood planning regions that were designated, which will result in 15 regional flood plans. $20 million will be allocated amongst these 15 flood planning regions so that they're able to hire technical consultants, which will help them create the regional flood plans. There will be 12 voting members for each of the 15 flood planning regions, resulting in approximately 180 voting members. There will also be 7 non-voting representation, including one from TWDB, in the 15 floodplain regions, resulting in about 150 non-voting members. The 15 floodplains should come together as one state floodplain, which is due in September of 2024. The regional floodplain groups will be self-governing. They will make the decisions. It's expected to be a collaborative process. Like I mentioned in my previous slide, each group must represent one of the 12 interest categories, which are agricultural interests, industries, river authorities, counties, municipalities, water districts, flood districts, electric generating utilities, public water utilities, environmental interests, and small businesses. Each group by statute must maintain non-voting members from TWDB, TCEQ, Department of Agriculture, GLO, TDM, the Texas Soil Boards, and TPWD. We worked with all of these agencies to develop the guidance principles that are included in the proposed rule. There should be adequate public process to develop the plans. The regional flood planning group will hold meetings where public input will be welcome. Like I mentioned before, the regional flood plans will roll into one statewide plan. After the first set of plans are done, it will be a 5-year planning cycle. But as you can see, we don't quite have 5 years to do our first set of regional and state flood plan. The regional flood plan will be the first statewide evaluation of flood risk. The regional flood plan will recommend flood management solutions which must not have negative impact to the neighboring areas. They will also consider contribution and impact to water supply. The flood plans are supposed to be based on best available science and data. Atlas 14, where available, is one example. The plans will be guided by Senate Bill 8 rules and the Texas Administrative Code Chapter 361 and 362. The guidance documents are currently being developed by TWDB. The regional flood plans will be due on January of 2023. I'm going to touch on the components of the regional flood plan. The regional flood plans will identify a specific flood risk. They'll look at known flood risk areas with existing FEMA maps, areas with better available maps. They're going to look at date-based map coverages. The maps current or are they old? They're going to look at local regulatory maps, which in some cases could be better than the FEMA maps. They're going to look at areas with historic flooding from historic knowledge. There may be areas with no maps, but there is historic knowledge of flooding. And then they're going to do a gap analysis. So they'll identify the areas where there are no map coverage, where there's no coverage of known flood risk. These would include, where possible, urban flooding as well. As we know, FEMA and as a state, we have a pretty good coverage of riverine flooding, but the urban flooding is still an area which could benefit from some kind of mapping approach. So the regional flood planning groups are to identify that. The next step, they're going to do risk analysis. They're going to perform existing condition flood risk analysis and future condition risk analysis. The risk analysis was a 3-step process, which comprises of flood hazard analysis, flood exposure analysis, and vulnerability analysis. The flood hazard analysis determines the location, magnitude, and frequency of flooding, which is the where and how large and how often of flood risk. Once flood hazard analysis is done, flood exposure analysis will be done. Once you know where it's going to happen, they're going to look at who and what might be harmed within the region. And the last step is vulnerability analysis. The vulnerability will look at the critical facilities and also flood resilience. They're going to look at if there is any police station, fire station, schools, hospitals, any other critical facilities that are located within areas with identified flood risk. Resilience is an ability of a community to bounce back after any hazard happens, including flood hazard. So the vulnerability analysis would cover these pieces. And the risk will then be a combination of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. The other components of regional flood plan, the next step is the community is going to set their protection goals. The regional flood planning groups are going to set their protection goals. They are to set which level do they want to protect their infrastructures. They're also going to identify flood management evaluations, which will identify areas that will need further analysis to identify flood risk appropriately. They're going to identify flood management strategies, which are long-term solution ideas that still needs to be formulated. For example, regulatory requirements. This may or may not involve construction components. They're going to identify flood mitigation projects, and this is going to be both structural and non-structural. The regional flood plans will focus on both reducing existing flood risk to life and property, and also floodplain management in general to avoid increasing flood risk in the future by keeping future population out of the way of flood flows. We are currently in the process of developing guidance documents to help guide the flood planning process. We're doing guidance document on hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, mapping, some guidance on protection goals. We are preparing guidance for benefit cost ratio analysis and hopefully a simplified tool to do benefit cost ratio analysis. So we know it can take significant amount of effort to do BCR analysis for this project, so we are looking at developing something that's simplified enough that will not take up a lot of effort from these planning groups. And lastly, we're also doing guidance for no negative impact. So the state flood plan, like I mentioned before, the regional flood plans will roll into one statewide plan. The state flood plan will be an evaluation of the condition and adequacy of flood control infrastructure on a regional basis, and it will come together as a state flood plan. The state flood plan will produce a statewide ranked list of projects and strategies. The plan will be guided by SB 8 and the Texas Administrative Code Chapter 362. The state flood plan is due on September 2024. So the last piece of my presentation today, so the timeline. Like I mentioned before, on April 9th, the board designated the flood planning regions. On May 21st, we started solicitation for the first set of regional flood planning group members. Our nomination process has come to a close. There are few regions and categories where we do not have a nomination for. We have received over 600 nominations for the 180 positions, but there are about 9 at the moment where we have 0 nominations. So we're only accepting nomination for those areas. For all the other areas, it's closed. The nomination is currently closed, and we're in the process of reviewing those nominations. Fall or late fall, we are hoping to take the regional flood planning group member nomination to the board. Once that is approved by the board, the planning group members, the initial planning group members will be informed. We're looking at October, November timeframe to set the first sets of regional flood planning group meetings. Each regional flood planning group will select a sponsor, as a political subdivision as a sponsor to sponsor those groups. And TWDB will then execute contract with those sponsors, and we're looking at January-February timeframe on that. And early 2020, the Regional Flood Planning Group sponsors will solicit technical consultants to support them with the regional flood planning process. And the last two dates are set by the legislature, and they're well set. To mention again, in January 10th, 2023, the first regional flood plans are due to TWDB. September 1, 2024, the first state flood plan is due to the legislature. What are our next steps? Like I mentioned, formation of the regional flood planning groups. We're only doing targeted nomination at the moment, and it's available on our website. We're working on preparing guidance materials and technical training materials for the flood planning group members. We are going to do a research study on social vulnerability index for flood risk reduction. After looking at the national information that's available, it appeared that there is no targeted data for flood risk reduction and social vulnerability index. I do not believe this will be done within the first planning cycle to incorporate it, but we hope to have it done where it can be incorporated in the next planning cycle, also make it available to flood risk reduction community to utilize it in other areas as well, in local communities for flood risk reduction projects as well. We'll allocate the $20 million amongst the 15 flood planning regions. It will be based on a funding allocation formula that we're working on. It is not a 15-way distribution. Rather, it will be looking at area, population, length of stream miles, etc. We're working on it currently. More information about the flood planning, Texas Water Development is available on the flood planning website. It's www.twdb.texas.gov/flood/planning. It has most of the recent information, and we'll continue to update it as we make progress. I'm going to very briefly touch on the flood mitigation financial assistance. So the 86 Texas Legislature, like I mentioned, passed a sweeping set of law which created SB 7, which created the Flood Infrastructure Fund, SB 8 that created the state and regional flood planning process, and then SB 500, which allowed the appropriations, including the $793 million for Flood Infrastructure Fund and $47 million for flood risk mapping and planning. This next slide is a brief overview of how that money is allocated. The $793 million is going to FIF fund, and then the $47 million for floodplain management account, that's what's covering all of the flood planning stuff and all of the flood science stuff, and also the programs. Those are all the mapping program that my colleague Saul is responsible for, and the planning program that I am responsible for. That $47 million is covering that. With that, thank you for having me today at this EWRI presentation. If you have any questions, I'll take that on the Q&A portion or in the Q&A text boxes here. Here is my contact. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. And have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks. Bye.